Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, completely dumbfounded by the concept of an NFT, or else a scrappy upstart, trying to sell your steampunk dance record as an NFT for $100,000, this is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every songwriter seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the second Friday of March 2021, and I thank you for joining us. This week's very special episode is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made, and it would always be some guy named Felipe who drove a murdered-out Geo Prism with racing stripes, and who was always trying to sell you what he said was CBD oil, but which was actually just children's Motrin. And Felipe would charge you about $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. But it's the future now. You guys, that's not how it works anymore. We're allowed to have nice things now. One of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music and merch commission-free. It's an absolutely wonderful product. The Working Songwriter podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com to try it for free for 30 days. Just use the promo code TWS, the initials of our show, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Well, if you listen to this show regularly, you know that I start off every show with a bunch of harassment. I harass you about supporting the show at Patreon, about spreading the word, about watching Sunday songs, about leaving us a review. But there's not going to be any of that today, because today's show is a very special show. It is the commemoration of 5 years and 100 episodes of The Working Songwriter. And with that in mind, the only thing to say that really feels right is thank you. Thank you to each one of our guests who have given us a whole hour of their time to chat. Thank you for the guests who came on our show super early when we didn't even really have a listenership. Thank you to all of our sponsors, Bandzoogle chief among them. And of course, thank you, the listener. Thank you for listening to the show every week. Thank you for writing me with guest ideas. Thank you for letting me know when I bounce the episodes wrong and I end up cutting off the ending. Thanks for all of our Patreon members for kicking in a few bucks and helping me keep the lights on. Thank you for telling me to not pan the two voices in the conversation because it sounds like hell. And thanks for just writing to tell me that the show has made a difference for you in your creative life. When I started this show, I thought that I would learn some techniques for songwriting or maybe some tricks in the business from other writers, but of course what I learned wasn't really any of that. Instead, I just learned that I'm part of a larger community of people who all love this Ahab and the White Whale adventure of tracking down a song, in a community of people who all get high on the idea that you can just wrest a classic song out of thin air in 10 minutes if everything is just right on one afternoon, and a community of people who ultimately root for one another to succeed in their same pursuit. I recorded this interview with Dan Wilson 3 months ago. He was so instructive and so insightful and vulnerable and wise and funny. I almost lost it after I got off the phone, because this interview is everything that I ever wanted the show to be when I started it. So I asked Dan and his team at the time if we could save the interview for this special occasion, and to their eternal credit, they said yes. So this interview is, to me, what it sounds like to listen to the quintessential working songwriter. Well, this interview and the Todd Snyder interview. No one will ever surpass Todd in my heart, but this one is different, but just as good. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation, and I just want to let you know how much I have enjoyed being on this ride with you guys for the last 5 years. Thank you for listening. Our guest this week is a songwriter that you either know or you don't know that you know. His songs have been so ubiquitous over the last 25 years that you would practically have to have been living in an off-the-grid, flat earth, agro-hippie commune to have never heard them. If you watched along with 180 million people on YouTube as Adele took the world by storm with her 2011 Brit Awards performance, you've heard one of his songs. If you listen to country radio when the Dixie Chicks bounced back from their post-Iraq War radio blackballing, you've heard one of his songs. If you've ever stayed past last call at your favorite bar and the bouncer had to walk you to the door while the opening piano notes rang out to closing time, you've heard one of his songs. Dan Wilson hails originally from Minnesota, and after graduating from Harvard with a degree in visual arts, he returned to the fertile underground music scene in Minneapolis. He saw regional success with his first band, Trip Shakespeare, but it was with his band Seminsonic that he stepped on to the national stage. Their hit song Closing Time went to the top of the charts for 13 weeks and lifted their sophomore album to platinum status. Since then, he's become one of the most sought-after songwriters in the world, having written with and for John Legend, the Dixie Chicks, Weezer, Florence and the Machine, Pink, and most famously, Adele. He co-wrote her smash hit, Someone Like You, which, at the time of this writing, sits at a cool 967 million plays on Spotify. Writing one ubiquitous song in a career is the stuff of legend. Writing a pair of them puts a songwriter in truly rarefied air. Dan Wilson has a pretty good case for being the most all-around successful and influential songwriters in America and around the world. So, needless to say, it was an honor to sit down a few months ago with him to hear about his journey so far. Dan Wilson, thanks so much for being part of the Working Songwriter podcast. Of course, you're now known as a legendary and renowned songwriter, but early on it looked like your career might have taken a different artistic path. You studied visual art when you were at Harvard. It looked like that was the route that you were going to take. What did your career path look like at first, and how did that change?
Well, when I was in my early 20s, I had been in bands through high school and college. I had always been involved in music, but I really did assume that eventually I would be a gallery artist of some kind, probably a painter. I studied printmaking in college at Harvard and continued on after I finished school and got gallery representation in Minneapolis. But music kept coming up. Music kept coming up, and better things kept happening in music. And eventually, it's not like I had to choose between art and music. It's more like I got really busy with music, and I realized that solitary life of an artist wasn't for me compared to the much more connected, community-based world of playing in bands, doing gigs, performing for people.
And speaking of being community-based, I mean, I couldn't think of a better community to come out musically of than Minneapolis in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, that was such a fertile ground. Can you kind of describe the music scene that was around you, both with Trip Shakespeare and then later with Semisonic?
Yeah. Minneapolis, I in retrospect, we kind of knew it at the time that it was a great place to be a musician. And in retrospect, it seems even more clear. My brother Matt had very consciously, he had gone to Harvard for a while and then went back to Minneapolis because he felt like that was a place to get a start as a musician. And he very consciously made his start in Minneapolis because he thought it was just a great scene for musicians. Prince was happening. There were all the spin-offs of Prince and the sort of post-punk bands like The Suburbs and Husker Du were incredible, and Replacements were incredible examples for us, and they made us feel like, well, you could do whatever you want in music from your hometown, and that was really exciting to us. We didn't really realize that there were other things at play. For example, City Pages, our local kind of music, entertainment, politics newspaper, indie newspaper. It turns out it was an amazing kind of breeding ground for great music journalists, and that was something that we didn't really. We kind of took it for granted, but it was a huge part of our community and of the greatness of the Twin Cities at that time.
Yeah, and music journalists, in some ways, were so much more important back then, pre-streaming, because people really had to make decisions about what albums that they were going to buy beforehand, rather than just, well, I'll flip on Spotify and see if I like it or not. And I think for some of our younger listeners, it's hard to appreciate how much journalists could break bands at that time.
Yes, and also the now because of social media and the internet, the kind of community voice that we hear is more of a group voice, more of a blend of everybody's point of view, or when an artist becomes popular in an indie or underground way, first there's this kind of groundswell of our collective opinions or our collective voices, our collective ways of thinking. But at the time in the 80s and 90s, the music journalists were the ones who gave shape to those thoughts. That was where our community kind of spoke, interestingly, and that was a big part of, and it was smart people writing interesting things about music, and that was influenced us a lot.
I'm kind of torn on whether I like the new version better or not, because in some ways it's really democratized how people find out about music, but in other ways you could have really visionary writers pick out a band that people didn't know that they would like at first, and made people give them a second look, kind of.
Yes, and I think there's another element. It's kind of hard to support, I think, but if someone's writing a great piece about music, you're enjoying their words, you're enjoying their writing as a kind of a work of art, such as it is. And I think, I recently read an article called 64 Reasons to Celebrate Paul McCartney. And it was a beautiful piece of writing. It was really interesting how enjoyable it was, just purely as following the thread of someone's thoughts. And I think that still exists now. And there's people like Ann Powers who write really, really provocative, thoughtful, cool things about music still. So it's not like a completely lost art, but it's less of it's a less loud voice in the conversation.
It certainly is. Can you talk to me about your first band on the scene, Trip Shakespeare, and what was that like? Were you guys touring regionally? Were you touring throughout the United States? And what do those tours look like, and how formative were they for you?
Trip Shakespeare started out, my brother started it with Elaine Harris and John Munson on drums and bass. And my brother Matt played guitar. And they started playing in a kind of kind of a local bar scene in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And at the same time, excuse me. Sorry, Joe. At the same time, there was a kind of growing medium circuit of bands that played original music in the Midwest. And the bands like the Rainmakers were in that circuit, and from Wisconsin, and Trip Shakespeare. I joined the band, and we started to really try to get serious about playing outside of the Twin Cities, and we ended up on this kind of like 6 or 7 or 8 week cycle of playing towns within 500 miles of Minneapolis. And we went to Kansas City, we went to Iowa City, we went to Cedar Rapids, we went to Madison, Milwaukee, Chicago, Fargo, etc. It was like a kind of a medium-sized circuit that we really, really worked hard to play. And we Trip Shakespeare went around in an Econoline, a Ford Econoline van with all of our gear in the back, and us kind of sitting on top of some of it. And we slowly expanded over the course of maybe 4 years and 2 indie albums. We expanded so that a couple times a year we were able to go to the East Coast. Once a year we were able to go to the West Coast. And, this is all essentially without a label or any kind of institutional support. And that's how we sort of learned how to, I don't know, be entertaining, improvise in front of people, make things up as we went along.
Yeah, I'd say even more impressive than doing it without a label at that time would be doing it without GPS.
Oh, late nights after a gig in St. Louis, trying to find the Motel 6.
Yeah.
Out by the airport, arguing about, it was a left turn on Frontage Road B, and just like, and a precious sheet of paper from our booking agent, the only like clue as to where we were going. That was, we would drive into a town without our cell phones, and all of us would kind of, as we were getting closer to the venue, we'd spot the payphone that we were going to walk to call our girlfriends or boyfriend or wife, and we'd see a payphone and be like, sort of quietly say, okay, this is like 3 blocks from the gig. I'm gonna walk over to this one and go home.
Oh man, that's a trip. What did you take away from that experience, that true, indie touring experience and indie release schedule? What did you take away from that you brought into, in a business sense, to Semisonic, which was a project on a larger scale and on a larger cultural scale? What did you take business-wise from that more indie approach?
Well, I couple things. One, doing it yourself is a pain, but it's good to know all the mechanics of how things work. What a booking agent does, and how one advances a show. Like how to do the kind of advanced promotional work for a show, so it's not like spitting in the ocean. There's a lot of things about just the way the business works, but also just the way the business allows you to connect to an audience that we learned because we did it ourselves. We mailed all the records to the college radio stations, and we did all those kind of like old school kind of projects that, if we'd had a label that we wouldn't have had to touch. On the other hand, and going into like Semisonic, a larger scale, but mostly because Trip Shakespeare's fandom was a platform. My main goal with Semisonic was to keep making music, and I wanted to write things that could be played on the radio. And I think I had figured out with Trip Shakespeare how important it was to have an audience and to try things out in front of an audience. We really, like, Matt wrote most of the songs. My brother Matt wrote most of the songs for Trip Shakespeare, and we'd get a new song and we'd practice it in sound check and we'd try it that night. And it really was, that was something I continued to kind of revere, just playing it in front of people, trying it out in front of people. And I was just more interested in figuring out how to boil things down and simplify things enough so that it could get on, that they could get played on the radio and catch people's ears who didn't know the special lore of me or my group.
Yes. That is such a good way of putting it, because I think artists sometimes can get really caught up in that. I mean, kind of smelling their own farts a little bit and thinking that everyone is so dialed in on them. And, when really, what music is and what your music can be for people a lot of times is just like, oh, yeah, I like that song a lot. And they're not thinking about you the other 364 days of the year in 23 hours, and so right. It's so you kind of attribute that to being able to connect in that way because you were doing a simplification process in your writing?
Partly. I think one thing about Trip Shakespeare versus Semisonic was that Trip Shakespeare, we were very, you had to come to us aesthetically. We thought that what we were doing was great, but we also, there was almost like you had to walk a winding path through the woods to get to our witch's cottage. We weren't going to make things easier to understand or relate to if we didn't feel it. And I think that's all cool for people who already have drank your Kool-Aid, or who already know the lore around you. But with Semisonic, I just started to realize, okay, what about a song that no one's heard before? What about a brand new song and no one knows the artist? What about that song makes it grab your attention and tells enough of a backstory about the artist so that you don't have to buy in right away to the artist's special cabin in the woods? I think Semisonic was partly my effort to make a bunch of songs really, that could half stand on its own, but half exist within my personal kind of myth or ideals.
I like your analogy of cabin in the woods. It strikes me as the artistic equivalent of a van down by the river.
Of what?
Chris Farley's A Van Down by the River. So clearly, the first song that you were able to find like that would grab people's attention immediately. You've had many of them at this point, but your first one was obviously Closing Time. Did you know that when you wrote that song? Did you say, okay, I found it here and this is going to connect immediately, or did it begin to reveal itself as you played it for other people or as it went to radio?
I confess I didn't really know what it was going to become. The people around me did, but I didn't. I had, Semisonic had a half a dozen radio singles at the point when we made Closing Time. So I had the chance of hearing our stuff on the radio and what was translating and what sounded extraneous or unneeded on some of those other songs. I started to realize how blocky and simple you could be and still have a kind of mystique and beauty in a single. And so with with Closing Time, in a way, that was a kind of a simplification and amping up of a previous song of ours called If I Run.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a radio single, and it did okay, but the audience didn't hear it, and there was just certain things about If I Run that were just kind of superfluous. Too much lead guitar, and I like playing lead guitar, but in Semisonic, in Closing Time, instead of having lead guitar just all over the entire song all the time, I put an epic bit of lead guitar in the middle that was like a giant, tower of lead guitar, as opposed to like a constant vine growing all over the song. And I think that was like really, that was the kind of thing that I was trying to do with Closing Time. But I didn't know, I talked to my lawyer after we finished the mix, and we sent him the record, and he said, he called me up and said, Dan, you've finally written something dumb enough to be a hit. And I said, it's not a dumb, Closing Time, that's not a dumb song. That's a really cool song. It's really smart. And he goes, no, it's really dumb. And I think he thought that was like some sort of compliment, or something, like, you did it. It's dumb, but I actually think it's a really good song, and it's got a cool melody, and the structure is unusual, and the way it works is not typical. You can't, the title is in the verse, or is the verse the chorus, and the chorus is like a bridge, but the chorus is also a hook. There's a lot of things about, and it changes key and goes into kind of a dreamy orchestral, ballet moment in the middle. There's a lot of things about it I thought were really smart. But the consensus around me was like, yes, a dumb song, yay. And I guess partly because it's about, the club. It's and drinks. There is something kind of. I didn't think of it that time because we basically lived in bars. We were always in bars all the time. So I didn't really think of that as like, oh, what a great topic for a song. You're writing about the club and, having your last drinks, well, yeah, but I wasn't thinking, oh, the golden subject matter,
I'm of the mind, I think this might be an apocryphal quote, but I believe Woody Guthrie said, any idiot can make something complicated. It takes a genius to make something simple. And I genuinely believe that. I think the ability to take complex ideas and put them somewhere between like a 7th and 10th grade reading level is it can be a singular artistic achievement. And I think it's harder to do than using a bunch of $10 words.
It's so true. And I mean, it's, to be fair, it's hard to write a complicated song too. It's just hard. Yeah. But then what no one tells you is that it's harder to write a simple song. But there's a difference. You can simplify something and make it worse. It's something that it's not a matter of having a complicated idea and then boiling it until there's nothing left. It's more like having a simple idea you can stand behind melodically or title-wise or whatever. Having a simple idea that says a lot that's the real thing, and that you got to get lucky on that. I think think about like the Gettysburg Address. The famously short speech that Lincoln thought was a dud, and because short, possibly too simple, wasn't sure the message would get across, and people still think about it and read it when a lot longer, more elaborate speeches are forgotten.
I completely agree. That song Closing Time, though, that transcended even like, oh, hey, we had a hit on the radio and stayed at number one. Like, it's genuinely become a cultural touchstone in so many ways. What's your relationship with that? How do you even wrap your head around something that has reached that sort of level of cultural relevance?
I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing if I think about it too hard. if someone came from the future, you know, in 1998 and told me, "Oh, this new single you have is going to still be played on the radio," you know, 20 years from now, I'd be like, "Oh, please, really?" Like, and if someone had said, "Oh yeah, you know," I thought it was going to get played in the bars. I literally thought it was going to be Last Call, a funny thing for people to play in the bars. I thought I'd get a lot of high fives from my friends who were wait staff or you know, bartenders. And I thought when I wrote it, I was like, "Oh man, they're going to love this," you know, down at the 400 bar.
Right.
But I didn't know that it was going to be this long-standing reference point or punchline. You know, it's incredible.
What's the trippiest context that you've heard that song in? Like it's just popped on and you're like, what the hell?
Oh, I've heard it in a lot of contexts. I've heard it, you know, I've heard it during during a Super Bowl one time. That was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I've heard people, you know, I was watching The Office, a rerun of The Office with my daughter, and one of the characters began singing Closing Time. And then it became almost like a little plot point, the song Closing Time on this rerun of The Office. Things like that are just like, they're like unexpected.
Yeah.
I've always been really like, I've always been really picky about like, if, you know, if somebody asks to use one of my songs for some sort of secondary purpose, like a TV show, I think of a TV show as like a secondary purpose for a song, you know?
Right.
And if someone wants to use a song for that, I'm really, really picky about it. So they have to describe what the scene is like. I don't, you know, Closing Time, I'm sure that they want to play that song when one mobster murders another one, but I always say no to those, you know? And so so I do think about those moments, but then when the actual, then it's a year later when I accidentally, you know, hear it on something that I've said yes to. Do you know what I mean? So It's always just like, oh, what surprise for me.
Talk to me a bit about your second chapter after Semisonic. You go on to make a few solo albums. The first of them is with Rick Rubin. Is that when you ended up? You're in Los Angeles now, I believe. Is that when you ended up making the move to L.A.?
No, I stayed in Minneapolis and did a lot of the recording of Free Life in Minnesota. And then I would bring the tracks to LA and I'd bring the files and Rick and I would talk about them, and we'd, you know, go to a studio and change things, or he would give me a vast amount of notes and send me back home to Minneapolis. I continued working from Minneapolis for all the aughts. And did a lot of collaboration with Rick long distance. And then finally moved to LA in 2010.
So you were well prepared for the coronavirus pandemic way of working, is what you're telling me, by doing it remotely.
It was funny. I was somewhat spoiled by my distance from the business for a bunch of reasons. Some of them kind of funny. If someone came to Minneapolis to write with me, they couldn't call, you know, from the Radisson downtown or whatever, you know, the Marriott, and say, oh, I'm just not feeling it today. Or, you know, oh, I totally forgot today is Elton John's birthday and I can't come to the session. Or, you know, my dog needs to get a haircut, or a palm tree fell in my pool. I need to oversee the workers. You know, in LA, there's always a million excuses for people who live here to not go to a session. But at the time in Minneapolis, when I was writing with pretty prominent people and they were coming to Minnesota, they just had nothing to do but come over to my house. And so it was very focused, and I enjoyed that. But I still had to be in person mostly with people. And even with Rick, when we would do work remotely. It was more like he and I would get together and he'd give me a list of possible things to try, and we'd listen and talk and like hang. And then I would go back on my own and try things. So it was still dependent on the vibe of being together. And I feel like that's, so I'm suffering from the isolation as a creative person, just like anyone else would be.
Got it. I'm loving the idea of people coming up with Minneapolis-based excuses for not being able to come to a session. Like, I'm sorry, it's just, there's a big sale down at Kramarczuk's. I got to go down and get some sausages tonight.
Yeah, I've got an ice dam in my gutters, and I've got to go up on the roof and chip it off. I can't come to the session.
This week's episode is brought to you by Nation of Heat Records and my new album, The Diving Sun, to be released on March 19th, 2021. Let's take a listen to the first single, Crescent Bridge. What began as a search for songs for a B-sides album morphed into an obsessive remix and morphed again into a proper album process. This new album features songs from sessions from my album Windfall and from The Flooding Color, and also a handful of songs written and recorded during the COVID quarantine. The result is an album that's unlike any other I've ever produced, but which also stands shoulder to shoulder with any album I've ever released.
And a feeling that you can't admit. It drives a dark car, no heart, rebel with a gold card. I'm here waiting on the Crescent Bridge, and she's a true bride, bright side, parliaments and brown eyes. I'm here waiting on the Crescent Bridge.
That's entitled Crescent Bridge from the forthcoming album, The Diving Sun. Go to joepugmusic.com to hear it in its entirety. For 5 years, I have not repeated myself with any of these episode interludes. I've never given the same piece of history or read the same poem. But today, on the occasion of our 100th episode and 5th year, I can't help but be drawn back to this Charles Bukowski poem. I first read it on Hayes Carl's initial appearance on the podcast. And as time goes by and I learn more about creating, both in my own songwriting and listening to other writers on this show, I think this poem, better than any other, sums up what it's all about. So please indulge me as I read again for the second time on this program, Charles Bukowski's Style. Style is the answer to everything, a fresh way to approach a dull or dangerous thing. To do a dull thing with style is preferable to doing a dangerous thing without it. To do a dangerous thing with style is what I call art. Bullfighting can be an art, boxing can be an art, loving can be an art, opening a can of sardines can be an art. Not many have style. Not many can keep style. I have seen dogs with more style than men, although not many dogs have style. Cats have it with abundance. When Hemingway put his brains to the wall with a shotgun, that was style. Or sometimes people give you style. Joan of Arc had style, John the Baptist, Christ, Socrates, Caesar, Garcia Lorca. I have met men in jail with style. I have met more men in jail with style than men out of jail. Style is the difference, a way of doing, a way of being done. 6 herons standing quietly in a pool of water, or you, naked, walking out of the bathroom without seeing me.
How did you're so well known now for songs that you've written for and with other people. How did you become interested into that? Did you stumble into that line of work, or did you very consciously get into that line of work? Tell me how your career went in that direction.
That was, I mean, I didn't know it would work, but that was definitely a intentional. Couple different things. When I was a kid, my parents had a Carole King album, Tapestry, and I would periodically hear the songs from Tapestry in other versions by other artists. You know, Aretha Franklin singing Natural Woman, or You've Got a Friend. You know, James Taylor sang that song. But so I slowly kind of learned that Carole King was an artist that, you know, but she wrote things on other people's records. And that was really, really interesting to me. That was really fascinating to me. And I thought about that a lot when I was a kid, but I mostly wanted to be Elton John. A performer. And then when Trip Shakespeare was happening, I really was struggling with like how to write a good song. It was not easy for me. My brother Matt kind of cracked the code first. And it took me a while longer to write a finished song that felt like a standalone piece of art, if you want to call it that. That took me a while. And so once that clicked for me, I got really obsessed with it. Once I wrote my first song that felt like, oh, wait a minute, this is a song and I can just sing it for someone. I don't need to explain anything about it or talk to them before I play it for them or anything. I just sing it for them. Once I felt like I had done that, I got really obsessed and I wrote a lot of songs. And I think there was a time in Semisonic when I had this idea that, you know, if I wrote 60 songs for Feeling Strangely Fine and we only used 12, I had this notion that I could find some way to sell the other 48. And that turned out not to be true. That's just not the way it works. People aren't going to use your 59th best song, you know, for their record. You can sing that yourself, buddy. You know, I want your best one. And that's how everybody feels when it's cutting someone else's song. You want the best one. But at the time I thought, okay, maybe I could turn this into like a way of becoming like, you know, my hero, Carole King. And so I sort of put word out and told a lot of people I wanted to, you know, co-write songs and write songs for other artists and what could happen. And nobody from my Minneapolis community wanted to. Everyone was too embarrassed about their own songwriting method. Everyone would say something like, oh, the way I write songs is just so dumb. It's embarrassing. I can't do it with anyone else. So I really assumed that their embarrassing method was like somehow special and unique. But later it turns out that everybody has the same basically embarrassing method of writing a song or variations on the same embarrassment. At the time, though, my friends just basically all turned me down. And I think the first person that I told my publisher I wanted to do this. I told my manager that I wanted to do this. And the first person that someone came up with, you know, my publisher came up with was Bic Runga. Mm-hmm. Can you know, try writing a song with Bic? She's fantastic, and she's writing a follow-up to her record that had the song Sway on it, I think. Mm-hmm. And so Bick and I wrote a song together, and that went great. It was really fun. I feel like the song had some kind of vibes, and it ended up in a movie. Lots of good things happened to that song, which is kind of amazing. And then little tiny things started to happen. Well, one other giant thing happened. One of my other publishers, by chance, was talking to my manager, Jim Grant, on the phone when Carole King called him. Called my publisher, and my publisher said, "Hey, let me get back to you." And he talked to Carole King, and then he asked my manager, "This is 1999? Could that be right? Mm-hmm. Something like that." Carol's heard Dan's songs. She'd love to write a song with him if he wants to do that.
Wow.
And that was my second kind of, official co-write. And then that was amazing. That was like a masterclass, essentially.
I'll bet.
I learned a lot. And it was very it was definitely like it's who you know, blah, 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 because it was my publisher. But it resulted because I had been bugging everybody. I want to write songs with people, and it wasn't so much of a thing. There wasn't a large menu of people that I'm at the time might write a song with, for them or for me,
In your view, what are the particular challenges of co-writing a song rather than writing it by yourself, and how do you overcome those?
Well, a lot of people come up with a kind of philosophy of their art or their music as this sort of singular, private, magical, personal, experiential gift that is theirs alone. And bringing someone else into that really bugs a lot of artists. Not even because they've tried it, just because it goes against the idea of your art as a magical outflow of your own point of view and your own experience and your own aesthetic. And I think that's fine. That's fine. But if you've been in a band writing a song on stage during sound check, you don't care about that very much. You don't think of your art as like a private, experience for you alone to enjoy. You've already been polluted by other people's presence because you're in a band, and that's where I came up. So I think sometimes like people's just sense of like the sacredness of their own private experience making music makes it hard for them to co-write, because then they're with someone else whose opinions might be wrong and whose vibes might interfere. And, there's plenty of reasons to think that it won't work. And I think that's all well and good until you try it. You just have to try it. And a lot of times people come to it with that kind of like precious attitude. They try it a couple times. They have a great experience with someone else. They get good music to happen, and then they just kind of drop the objections. And other times a person just can't do it. Some people also take a month to write one song, and that's hard to do with someone else.
Oh, yeah, I'll bet. Obviously, you wouldn't have to name names here, but have you had situations where it just didn't work at all, and you just had to just call the whole session quits?
Yeah, I've had sessions like that. Not super often, but early on, I had a session with a British songwriter who had been put together with me, I believe, because she was having a kind of a writer's block. This is early in my kind of working with other people experience. And I just had this interesting sense, a couple hours, like an hour and a half in, that none of my ideas were going to sound right to this artist. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty much dead set against having any ideas themselves at that time. And I just had this thought, we are not going to write a song. This is actually not going to happen. But I didn't think of it as like something I was resentful about. It was just more like, wow, we're not going to do this. And there's nothing I can do to change that. And that was very liberating in a way. And I said, hey, you know what? I have a feeling we're not going to write a song today. Through, nobody's fault. It's not a problem. But is there a museum near here? Because I'd love to go walk around a museum instead. And if you want to go with me, you can. And if you want to send me off, let me know. And the artist I was working with, we did a little research and found that I was just a few tube station stops away from the Tate. So I said goodbye, and I went to the Tate, and I had a great day. And I think that was like very liberating for me. Like, you don't have to have an outcome, it's cool. And not only that, sometimes a person is going to make sure you don't get an outcome that day. Maybe their confidence is so low. You know what I mean? Maybe they just can't believe that something they can come up with today is going to be good. And so they're going to stop it from happening relentlessly. Once I realized that was one of the items on the menu and that it was fine, that was very liberating for me. I really, really, it doesn't happen often. Just every once in a while it happens. And I'm like, yeah, go to the beach.
Right. Obviously, one of your collaborations that was most fruitful was with Adele, and I was talking on the phone last week with Sean and Sarah Watkins, and they told me that I had to ask you about the quote unquote real story of writing and cutting someone like you. So it sounds like this is something that you've told before. I'm sorry to put you through your paces to maybe repeat a story here, but I do have to ask you, what is the real story then of working with her on that?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I only have one story, so I don't have a real story and a not real story. So I would only have one story about it.
Well, I'd love to hear it.
Someone Like You was started out as a session that Rick Rubin encouraged me to have with Adele, and he was also working with her at the time, and he was encouraging her to have a session with me, and it was somewhat canceled a few times, I think. Just didn't seem destined to necessarily happen. At the time, I was super into, she had a song called Chasing Pavements and one called Hometown Glory that I thought was amazing. And so I was psyched. So when we got together, it had been after kind of a couple close calls, and we got together in a small studio in Hollywood. And the first thing that happened, among the first things that happened were, first of all, she revealed herself immediately to be just a really funny person and super, super fun to talk to, and just as charming as she seems. And then she played me a whole bunch of YouTube clips by Wanda Jackson, the rockabilly queen, and that was amazing. Who does that, And then at one point she played me a few songs that she had worked on. She played me Rolling in the Deep, which I confess I didn't hear it and think, oh, it's an international smash. But I thought, oh, that's really good. Wow, that phrase is weird. Rolling in the Deep is weird. Mm-hmm. But I thought, oh, that's great. And it sounded great. It was already a mix, I think. It was already slamming. And at one point, in that early stage, she said to me, Dan, I have to confess, I'm not that familiar with your music, but me mum is a big fan, and we've been listening to your songs for these past few days. And I thought that was super sweet. I liked that. I liked that a lot for a couple of different reasons. Partly because when I worked with Carole King, I kind of made the mistake of telling her that my mom was a big fan of Carole's. I was too, but I thought it would be even cooler if Carole knew that my mom was a big fan. But I think Carole just felt old when I said that. So Adele and she played me two ideas. She played me a thing that would eventually become Rumor Has It. And then she played me the first 4 lines of what would become Someone Like You. Those were her two ideas. And I said, I'm pretty sure I said, you know what, the funny song is really funny, rumor has it, but I'm not great at writing kind of witty, funny songs like that. So I let's do the ballad. So we wrote 2/3 of the ballad on the first day. It had the second verse had some serious problems. It was like a verse, a chorus, a verse, and a chorus, pretty sure. And the second verse had some serious problems. And on the second day when we got back together, I said, so what do you want to do today? To Adele. And I said, do you want to work on that thing we worked on yesterday? Well, that kind of lets you know that I didn't realize it was going to be a big song at all, right? Because I was like, should we work on that, or do you want to start something? I said, do you want to start something new? And she said, oh no, we have to finish the thing from yesterday. I played it for my manager and my mum, and I said, oh, okay. I was slightly bummed because I don't like playing works in progress to people that have serious issues, because I feel like people are always like, no, it's fine, that it's just uncomfortable. So I rarely do that, but what I mean is, like, a recording that's half finished can be worse than just like busking a song to someone with a guitar or a piano and saying, here's a new song that's unfinished. But an unfinished recording just has a badness about it that's, I don't know, worse than busking the song. So she goes, I played it for my manager and my mom. And I said, well, what did they say? And she said, my manager loved it and my mom cried. And I was like, okay, that's good. And we finished the song. We took that bad part of the second verse and we turned it into a bridge and made it better. And then we wrote the second half of that second verse because we had suddenly lost half the second verse. And then Adele's voice was sounding really raw and kind of wild on the second day. And I asked her to sing the choruses of the song again, because the first day choruses were kind of smooth and not serene, but they were kind of smooth and professional sounding. And I wanted to hear what the choruses sounded like with her somewhat wilder, kind of a little bit roughed up sounding voice on the second day. And it sounded amazing. And then we had a little argument about those high notes in the chorus that she never has liked. And I said, hey, it's just a demo. You can take them out later. And then we finished the song and she zoomed off to a meeting with her label, and I didn't really hear much about the song for like 6 months. And then the label contacted me all in a hurry, like, can you send the parts to that demo? And there were 4 tracks. It was like stereo piano, vocal, and one harmony in a Pro Tools session. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll send it. And then they put it out as a single.
What was it like watching that song take wing? Was it a similar feeling that you had with Closing Time? Was it, what was the feeling, what was going through your head as you watched it just sweep the world?
Well, I'm going to maybe talk about this in a way that I haven't before. Just because it hasn't really come up. But my experience of watching it rise and rise and rise, and it started out, they did a live version of it on the Brit Awards, Adele and her piano player, and that immediately went into the charts the next day in England on the BBC. And it, one of the things it had that she liked was it didn't have those high notes in the chorus, but it also just was it was the event of the TV show from the Brit Awards, and it was sort of cool that the version from the Brit Awards was being, was instantly in the charts as a single. And then weirdly, the radio stations all started playing the album version that they had, and those 2 versions, the live TV performance and the album version of Adele and me playing the song, those 2 were both in the charts. And eventually the album version became a single, and they had planned for Rolling in the Deep have a different trajectory. And the label had this interesting experience of having both songs kind of, I think, on the chart at the same time. They didn't count on that. Meanwhile, my experience of it, I really almost hate to confess, because I have worked really hard on a kind of from childhood, a kind of intense anxiety that it's a lineage in my family, I guess. And worked really hard on sort of living in the present moment and not projecting too much into the future and not being obsessed about the past. And I just have to say that my experience of someone like you rising in the charts was a continuous experience of fearing that it would fall off the charts the whole time. And, that somehow that one morning would show up and something would have cracked and the song was gone. And that was not what I would have expected the experience to be like at all. I kind of would have thought it would be just like glory upon glory, And instead it was anxious. And I found myself checking the Nielsen, singles charts and I don't know, I wasn't annoyed when it would kind of plateau for a while. Or I wasn't mad. I just had I didn't have a peaceful relationship with that single and its success. Because in retrospect, it soared up and took over the world, and made everyone cry. But at the time, it was like anything else. It was like a fragile beginning, and it was kind of happenstantical. They hadn't planned to put it out as a single in the UK, I don't think, until the TV show happened. A lot of things had to randomly occur. And I think I was kind of living through my, hereditary, my legacy of anxiety with it, I would say.
It's interesting. I think you're describing a really human reaction there. What is it about us as human beings? Because, you set up a situation there in your mind where, it had to leave the charts eventually. So, and I've done that many times with things much smaller than that, obviously. But what is it about us as human beings that we set up little mental things like that we know are going to fulfill themselves, but we still let them torture us on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I don't know. And I think I console myself with a couple different things. My grandmother, when she was very old, and I loved her so much, and when she was very old, my wife and I were talking to her, and my wife said, "Is there anything that you regret?" And my grandmother said, "I regret that I refused to take a vacation in Hawaii with your grandfather because I thought it was frivolous. And the second thing I regret is worrying about everything so much." And I've really, really tried to take that to heart. We were very moved when she said that, and it just made us love her more. But I really have tried to take it to heart, and I think in something like a story about a song, like a story about someone like you, that's a story of a song that rose up the charts and broke everyone's heart and made its way into hilarious moments in Saturday Night Live, and now is kind of a talent show, mainstay.
It's a standard.
And it lives on, That's a story about the song. That's not what is happening at any given moment. And I think the lesson I learned from that song and its success is that, if you work hard enough, you can turn everything into a nail-biting, anxious, sort of nightmare. And not that it was a nightmare. I really don't want to overstate it, but I really had an anxious experience surrounding that song's success because I just thought it was more fragile than it was. Or you're right, it was going to end at some point. Why not just embrace that and say, this is really fun. I just saw them making a joke about it on Saturday Night Live. That's really fun. And at that point, once that happened, actually, once they made a big joke about someone like you on Saturday Night Live, I stopped worrying That was just like so funny to me and such a like, oh shoot. It's like one of those moments you're like, oh yeah, the song has totally made it. It's like, we can't worry anymore. It's like, it's just what it is.
Yeah. My kid had some weird times in his 20s, but he finally got a job and got married, and he's going to be all right.
Right. I mean, yeah. It's funny because telling you all about this is not the most comfortable thing, because like if I think about it, it's it sounds like incredibly entitled, because we all know how the story ended. And I wish it didn't sound that like that way. But on the other hand, a lot of us who are creative people, I mean, the obsessiveness, the compulsiveness that leads you to practice your craft, relentlessly, is a superpower for a musician or a creative person. But the relentlessness and obsessiveness of the brain containing that is sometimes a problematic thing. And I guess that's why I share it. I don't want people to think, oh God, Dan thinks that someone like you should have been even huger, or
No, that's not how
I felt about it.
That's not how it read at all. And I really appreciate that take. Before I let you go here, this is a program that a ton of songwriters and creative people listen to this. And one of your latest endeavors has been this deck of cards that's come out of a longstanding project of yours called Words and Music. And I think our listeners could be really interested in this project. Can you explain just a little bit about the project in general, and now the latest release of Words and Music in 6 Seconds, the deck that you have coming out?
Yeah. Words and Music in 6 Seconds started out as an online series wherein I just tried to say something helpful or perhaps insightful or maybe provocative about being a songwriter or being a recording artist or being a performer in a very short time. And I tried to teach myself how to be like an aphorist, to write the shortest little statement that meant a lot. And I posted them on Vine for a while and on Twitter and on Instagram. And then then eventually, because of one thing and another, I made a font for a project. I made my own font, and I started using the font to create kind of imaginary text cards for these quotes on my Instagram. And they looked really good as like almost like haikus about music. They had this kind of haiku-like quality. And one day a friend of mine, a songwriter friend of mine, Teddy Geiger, first of all told me that she loved my Instagram series, Words and Music in 6 Seconds, and quoted a bunch of them back to me. Like she quoted 3 of them back to me, which I was very moved by. And then told me that the quotes could make a great coffee table book or a small book for like a gift for a songwriter. And I went home and told my wife about this, and my wife said, "What about making a deck of cards, like a tarot, with those statements on it?" And I said, "Oh, you mean like Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies?" Mm-hmm. And my wife said, "I don't know who that is."
Right.
And I was like, "Oh, well, wow." So it's a good idea. This is a really good idea. So I made a deck of cards. It's like 75 cards. One is a little introduction. And then each card is one of the statements from my Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, my social media series called Words and Music in 6 Seconds.
It's funny. One of yours, of those that I really love, is basically the idea of the sounds like game is not a game that you want to play. And It actually sounds like your wife kind of pulled that on you by you saying, well, that sounds like Oblique Strategies.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
it turns out that only music nerds know about that,
I totally agree. And I think that the Sounds Like game is only helpful when you accidentally steal an entire song and you play it for a friend.
Right.
That's fine. If you think you wrote a song and it's simply exactly Better Now by Post Malone, then your friend is kind to tell you.
Right.
But if any resemblance short of that identical match is a waste of time in a session. Like I have I'll read you a couple cards.
Yeah, please do.
Don't worry too much about originality in the early stages. Sometimes the originality shows up later during the revisions. Here's another one. Write a song to close your shows. It's like the finale to an opera or a musical. Mozart did it. You can do it too.
I love that one. I love the idea of writing for a purpose, a specific need for a show. The damn things just seem to write themselves when you have that.
When you have an outside purpose that's not your ego, when you have an outside purpose that's like your friend is getting married, and they said, "Could you sing something?" Then it's not your ego. It's not like, "Oh, I'm exposing the beautiful flower of my inner life." It's more like, how can I express my feelings about these people that I like so much? It takes you out of the picture in a way that is so helpful.
I think I could figure out a way to put my ego into that anyway, but yeah.
Most of us can, but I think anything that gets you, like any kind of commission, if someone says, "Can you write a song?" I mean, a lot of my friends have songs that became their own hit that they wrote because some TV show was looking for a theme song or some ad was looking for a song. And they asked my friend, like, "Can you write us a theme song?" And the friend would go, "Yeah, sure. How about this?" And they'd send a song and the TV show would reject the song. And the friend would then have a song and then play it for their management or label. And the label would be like, "Wait a minute, this one's great."
Yeah.
And the artist is going, no, not that one, because I wrote that, that's a failed effort to write a theme song for a TV show. And everyone around the artist at this point is going, no, this is the best. This song, I don't care where it came from. It's great.
It's funny then, because I bet you a lot of times the artists, they're like, well, I don't have my ego invested in this one, so I don't care that you like this one.
I don't want it to be successful.
Right. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much for sitting down and doing our podcast. I've done a ton of these over the past 5 years, and this talking to you here today has been head and shoulders above so many others. It's been so interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. Joe, I feel like you kind of gave me a lot of wiggle room to answer at length, but I really enjoyed it too. I
Great.
really did.
All right. Well, thank you so much, brother, and I wish you the best throughout the rest of this weird COVID pandemic time.
Super weird. I'll see you on the other side.
This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Dan Wilson's latest project is entitled Words and Music in 6 Seconds, a creative tool for musicians, songwriters, and producers. If before we meet again, you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.